Welcome back to the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse. The Orioles have not been playing well on the field. Didn't have a good series, lost two out of three against the Marlins. Just barely squeaked by with a win in game three. And we are off to a really bad start. During this series against the Padres, we lost game one. And I'm recording in the middle of game two or during game two, and we are down 8-0 at the current time. So the Orioles have not been doing well on the field, but the Orioles have made uh, moves at this trade deadline or approaching this trade deadline that the Orioles pulled off two pretty big deal trades yesterday on Friday, and I am going to break them down. But before we get into that, just want to say that Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything online sports betting. Right now, you can receive a 50% free bet. I don't really know what a 50% free bet is, but I'm reading what I have here. You can receive a 50% free bet of up to $250 on your first deposit to bet on anything from the Olympics to baseball to Formula One racing. Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head over to the online casino, get in on a game of blackjack, poker, or unwind with over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. I use promo code BELIEVE to get 50% free bet credit. There it is again. Not sure what that means. 50% free bet credit. Yeah. Anyway, I'll let you all interpret that on your first deposit of up to $250. Bet online. The game starts here. All right. So it was interesting. Yesterday, I was going to record the episode, getting ready to record, and then hear news of a trade. So I also, before I get into this and before I detail what happened yesterday and sort of what was going on, I do want to just say that I am wearing my Cedric Mullins jersey t-shirt. It's a t-shirt that, you know, is kind of like a jersey. And it's a t-shirt, really. Um, but I am wearing my Cedric Mullins t-shirt just in case, which I hope it isn't, and I don't think it will be. I don't think he's going to get traded, but there have been some rumors and some speculation about that. So I am just in case he does end up getting traded. Um, I am wearing his shirt, so well, maybe it won't be the last Warehouse podcast episode before the trade deadline or before he moves, even because Eli is going to do an episode. I might have to advise him to wear a Mullins jersey too. He has an actual jersey, so I might have to advise him to do that. But yeah, just in the event that Mullins does end up getting moved, I'm wearing his shirt, just as yeah, just to, well, maybe it's some good luck that it won't happen, but I'm not really superstitious like that. I know what kind of baseball person am I to not be superstitious? Maybe I'm a little superstitious, but I don't think I'm impacting whether Cedric Mullins is going to get traded. But in any case, regardless, yeah, I am wearing the shirt just in the event and in case that he does get traded. But I don't think he will, and I hope he doesn't. Putting all that aside for a second, we did have some Orioles get moved yesterday. So basically, I was getting ready to record. I sort of had a plan, sort of had an outline. I was going to sort of cover mainly the Marlins series and some of the concerns and some of the trouble. It was really, in hindsight, it was a poor plan to execute that because I should have expected and anticipated that there was a high likelihood that something would change. So, got news that a trade had happened that I'll get into. And then as I was sort of getting ready for that and preparing, then news broke that another trade happened, right? So at that point, it was basically time for me to go, and I wouldn't have been able to sort of do due diligence. So I sort of put it off to today. And when I saw the initial thing on MLB trade rumors, I saw that we had gotten Eflin from the Rays, but they hadn't yet even said what the return was and what the Orioles were sacrificing. We now know that information, but then I wasn't able to record last night because of an event. So that's why I'm here doing it now. So in any case, yeah, so uh yeah, uh it's a little difficult to be an Oriole fan right now. I think that's pretty fair to say. Actually, I'm noticing I did not change Tyler Young in the corner here, and I think Eli will say something to me about this, but we're just gonna go with it. It's not worth changing in the middle of the episode. But yeah, so it's I will say I think it's really tough to be an Oriole fan right now. For one, the Orioles on the field are playing really bad. Um, the offense is not hitting at all, with the exception of maybe Santander and Colton Cowser. The offense is just not being effective, not being functional. Gunnar Henderson at the plate has been really, really bad in particular. He's had really his first rough stretch offensively during the season, but defensively as well, he's doing poorly. And he's made multiple errors the past few games, basically since the All-Star break. And yeah, it's pretty miserable baseball to watch. And I think everybody is aware that this Orioles team is a better team than how they're playing right now. This deadline uh theoretically could be utilized to inject some life and some hopes into this Orioles team. And I did sort of say that, at the deadline, a few days ago, I was talking to Eli and Tyler through our chat, and I had mentioned that it was upsetting because it sort of felt like our team needed to be overhauled. And Tyler pushed back on this term overhauled. And then, sort of I agreed with him after he said that. Overhaul is a bit strong, right? Especially for a team. We have our core basically. So, it's not like we need to rip everything down at this trade deadline and create a new roster. But there are sort of sections of this team that it does feel like sort of need to be overhauled a little bit, right? The starting rotation felt definitely like it needed some maybe not an overhaul, but it definitely needed something added to it. And the bullpen felt like it needed something added to it in particular. Arguably, there's also a case that the Orioles could add a bat. So even though the offense has been really good, they're struggling right now. And the bat argument has come out. Well, is sort of bolstered because the Orioles did trade away Austin Hayes. So, um, all right, so yeah, I'll just sort of get into the episode. So basically, um, yeah, we'll get into sort of the specifics of the trades, I guess. So the Orioles made a deal. I'm sure most people listening have heard about this, but the Orioles made a deal with the Phillies, which that alone is pretty fascinating. These are two teams that there is a decent possibility, even if it's not likely, but there's a possibility that these are teams that end up meeting in the World Series. So, sort of in the same way that you don't want to trade within your division because it's gonna create problems for you, and if you have close races you might be just bolstering the other team just a little bit uh to get them over the top to maybe excel above your team. So there is some interdivision concerns that you sort of have to have a little bit at least whenever you're trading with someone within your division. And it's sort of similar, actually, with the Phillies, with the Orioles, because there is like a decent possibility that these two teams meet in the World Series, even though they're not great. I would say, you know, it's probably less than 10% these two teams end up in the World Series playing against each other, but it's not zero either. The Orioles right now, I believe, are the best team in the American League, and the Phillies are the best team in the National League. So there's a lot of playoff stuff, of course, and a lot of end of the season stuff that has to happen in order for that to come to fruition. But it is a possibility. So the Orioles did make a deal with the Phillies, though. They ended up sending longtime Oriole Austin Hayes, I think. Uh, don't quote me on this either, but I think aside from Anthony Santander, he's the longest tenured Oriole. So uh, the Orioles did, we sort of have at this point a little bit of outfield depth. So we were trading sort of from a position of strength with our outfield, and we made a couple additions. So in return, we got Sir Anthony Dominguez from the Phillies, and we got Christian Pache from the Phillies as well. So Pache is also an outfielder, but it's a little bit of in terms of Hayes and Pache. Hayes is overall a bit better overall as a player. Pache is better defensively, but Hayes probably, of course, with Hayes, you always have to worry about the injuries, but he's a better hitter overall than Pache is. Now, of course, Pache did make it basically to the major leagues. I mean, he first played in the majors when he was 21 for the Braves. But he just had a few at bats. But ultimately, he ended up playing for the Braves at basically age 22. And that really speaks to his defensive abilities because he was such an outstanding defensive player. So, someone like Pache is a good person to have on the roster. Like in general, on a theoretical roster, someone like Pache is good to have. They can be good to have, like when it comes to playoffs, depending on like how matchups go and stuff like that. Maybe you want a defense first outfielder situation setup, and he's a good guy to have out there. Now he is fast, but he doesn't get many stolen bases. He doesn't have any this year. But I think a lot of that is also based upon playing time and number of at bats and stuff like that. Um, so what the Phillies are getting is they're sort of getting an upgrade in the outfield, and the Orioles in return are getting a downgrade in the outfield. But Pache, who will sort of function as a replacement for Hayes to some extent, but they're also adding a sort of back end of the bullpen. Uh, not a closer normally. He has a closing experience, but he's a guy in Sir Anthony Dominguez that is a back end of the bullpen guy. So the other thing that's notable about Dominguez, especially for this Orioles team that is gearing towards the playoffs, he does also have playoff experience, especially from being on this Phillies team. So ideally, he will be able to use that experience and be a positive force for this bullpen as the Orioles enter the playoffs. Now, as far as Dominguez goes, I mean, Dominguez has always had really good stuff. In general, historically, he's thrown really hard. Uh, in the high 90s for sure. And he is sort of a guy who, I mean, if you look at his like overall numbers this year, they're a little uh they're not great, and they're not what you would love, I guess I would say, from like a back end. I think most of the time when you're thinking about a back end bullpen piece, you want someone with an ERA in the low threes or the high twos, even. And of course, or someone like Emmanuel Clase, who has an ERA under one. But putting him aside, or maybe it's not under one, but right around one. But I think it is under one, but I'm not positive. But in any case, point is that so if you look at like some of his numbers, they don't like jump off the screen in terms of this year, but he is like a veteran sort of at this point in his career. He's been around the league for a long time. And I think that especially with this Orioles bullpen sort of being a little bit dicey at this point, it is really beneficial that the Orioles got someone like Sir Anthony Dominguez to hold down the back end of the bullpen. And I think the other thing that is notable and is important about especially acquiring Dominguez is that I think what I'm expecting. Of course, the Orioles just needed to add bullpen depth. Basically, the back end guys that we have right now are Cano, Kimbrel, and now Sir Anthony Dominguez. Those are really the back end bullpen guys that we rely on and that we go to. Now, we end up using other guys in situations in sort of back end type situations, whether that be extra innings or whether that be in the seventh or eighth, just because we don't have a lot of depth. But you know, I think guys like Jacob Webb that sometimes get used in those roles, or even Dylan Tate this year, unfortunately, those are not exactly the guys that you want pitching in the eighth inning. And especially when we get around to the playoffs, those aren't really the guys you want pitching in the eighth inning. I think the other thing that is notable, I think the Orioles sort of made this move. Now they might not, I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but they're not exactly done necessarily either. Just after these two moves. So as far as like the back end of the bullpen, I think that the Orioles tried to get Dominguez, knowing that he had some closing experience from the past. I think the Orioles signing Craig Kimbrell at the beginning of the year was good, but I think that there have been since the time we got him some concerns. He has, he had a really good first half overall. He had a few weeks where he struggled. And then again, he's sort of back in this phase where he's struggling. And Philly fans are haunted, unfortunately for them, are haunted by Craig Kimbrell's playoff performance last year. So this has been, I think, something that is in the Orioles' minds that okay, we've seen a few warning signs, right? We see that he had a really bad stretch earlier in the season for the Orioles. He's sort of in the middle of a really difficult stretch right now. And in addition to both of those things, we're thinking about last year and what it was like for Craig Kimbrell in the playoffs last year. Now, overall, Craig Kimbrell has a lot of playoff experience and he has playoff success as well. I'm pretty sure he was with the Red Sox when they won the World Series just a few years ago. Not positive, but I'm like pretty sure he was. So I think that it's not that Craig Kimbrell can't handle the pressure of the playoffs or anything like that. But I do think that I mean, at this point, he's getting older, and the Orioles are trying, I think, with the acquisition of Sir Anthony Dominguez, trying to create a contingency plan for if Craig Kimbrell happens to not perform when we get to the playoffs. If he happens to either be worn down from the duration of the long season and him just getting older and being older and uh you know being worn down after pitching through an entire season, or he's just not effective. So I think that Sir Anthony Dominguez is going to be an effective contingency plan Cano does have closing experience as well. I don't know how comfortable we feel with Cano trying to close games out for us in October, but I do think that if there are any warning signs sort of around Craig Kimbrell uh not doing well during the postseason, or maybe he blows a save or two when we get to the playoffs, I wouldn't be surprised if, we sort of move him sort of to like the seventh inning, have Cano in the eighth, and then use Dominguez uh, in the ninth to try to close out games. So I think that there is some possibility. And this is assuming Kimbrel doesn't, we don't try to hide Kimbrel on the bench for the playoffs. But in addition to just the playoffs, I think the same basic plan can be utilized going forward the rest of the season. And Dominguez, in a stretch perhaps like right now, Dominguez could be used in the ninth inning when we feel like Kimbrel doesn't have it together. So there is some possibility, even if he does turn into the eighth inning guy for us, that there is some possibility that it'll end up being, he's going to end up closing some games for us. So I think that is real, and I think that is part of the reason why the Orioles tried to acquire him. Now, the other thing that is worth noting is that Sir Anthony Dominguez has an $8 million club option for next year. And I think that is rather reasonable for somebody of his caliber. So this isn't just a 1 year thing for the Orioles. The Orioles can also elect to have Dominguez back on the team next year. So I think that is also valuable and important. It'll be, I think, one less decision the Orioles have to really think about for how to construct the bullpen. And I think he fits well. One of the sort of criticisms of this Orioles bullpen in the past has been, we don't get a lot of strikeouts. And we don't have a lot of strikeout pitchers, putting Kimbrel aside. And Cano definitely is not a big strikeout pitcher. Now he's a great ground ball pitcher. He's a great guy to bring in when you need a double play, but he's not going to get a lot of Ks. And Sir Anthony Dominguez gets, more than a K per inning. I think it's like 10 Ks per nine in general. So he does have more of a strikeout dynamic. So if the Orioles are in a situation in the playoffs where the Orioles really need a strikeout, he might be the guy to go to. So that is something that the Orioles can consider and can utilize him sort of in that way as the Orioles advance forward and move hopefully into the playoffs and hopefully deep into the playoffs. So I think overall this is like a fair trade. I think both teams sort of identified a need. I think that it's sort of a thing where because this sort of worked out so well, I think the some of the concerns about trading with a potential World Series matchup, uh, you know, didn't halt everything. I will also say it wasn't like really, really significant pieces were getting moved. It wasn't like the Orioles were trading Santander, for instance, to the Phillies for whoever, Alec Boehm, or that would never happen. But just saying like it's not like the centerpieces of these rosters were being exchanged. So it was sort of more peripheral guys other than maybe Dominguez. As far as like the Orioles, it's unclear how even how much even Austin Hayes would be used by the Phillies, when it gets around to the playoffs. So he might be used a bit, but he also might not really be used much. So, um, Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, it does seem like the Phillies will utilize him for the rest of the season. I think the Orioles also benefited in this trade because even though Hayes had a really rough first part of the year, had some injury things he was dealing with. He's had, I mean, he was not playing every day when the Orioles dealt him, but he had put together like an OPS over 150. I'm sorry, over 850 in his last like 100 plus at bats. So I think the Phillies sort of thought, okay, look, we're getting Austin Hayes. He is, doing he's hot right now. He's doing well. And then hopefully like he'll be benefit to us next year as well, but we'll be able to like figure that out. But let's take advantage of uh him being hot right now. Let's hopefully use him effectively. He's an upgrade and hopefully he can be hot when we get to the playoffs and we'll see what happens. So yeah, so I'm actually I think this is a really needed trade for the Orioles and from the Orioles perspective. I think it's really helpful for the O's because we did need some bullpen help, and Sir Anthony Dominguez definitely is bullpen help. So I think overall this was a really good move for the O's, and yeah, just the fact, I mean, the Orioles were sort of struggling with all the, outfield options that we sort of have. Right. Now, granted, the outfield options question isn't even that much alleviated because we did get back Christian Pache, and he's in a situation where he can't be DFA'd. I'm sorry, he can't be optioned without being DFA'd, which I think the Orioles are going to not do and not try to make that happen. So, yeah, I think that this outfield depth question, isn't exactly resolved because Christian Pache being added to the outfield mix. But I think with Hayes not being fully utilized, I think that there was, especially with Kerstad, and we even have Stowers in the minors, et cetera, et cetera. There's sort of the outfield was getting kind of crowded, and now Hayes is gone. But now the Orioles have someone like Christian Pache who uh I don't think the Orioles will DFA, but is potentially even another trade possibility. And he is going to sort of fill in and play for the Orioles, and sort of like fill the role. So the Orioles, have to figure out this outfield situation. It's a little interesting to try to see and figure out how Pache is going to fit into it. Um, Beyond, like what he will, to the extent that he will start and not, come in at the end as defensive replacements. And, so it's sort of interesting how the Orioles will try to navigate this, especially we have someone who can hit right-handed that can play center, but now he's playing that we have Mullins, we have Kauser in center theoretically. Like, so it's just sort of a question like, well, is Kerstad and him going to split time in left? But then, is Pache going to get some games in center with Kauser moving over to left? Like, it's a little unclear how all the pieces of the puzzle are going to fit together in this Orioles outfield. But Austin Hayes, even though he was a right-handed hitter, and he was good from that perspective, because Kerstad was lefty, he was righty, etc. So now that we have Pache, it's a little confusing how everything in the outfield is going to work itself out. But with that said, I think overall it's a good move. Definitely excited in particular for Dominguez because the bullpen help is really, really needed for this Orioles team. But we will see. Yeah, the question mark is just how this outfield thing works itself out. Tyler did mention in the chat, or in our texting conversations, that like Pache is sort of the he seems like one of the guys that would go to someone to a team like the Athletics that has multiple years of control that is, sort of a on the whole subpar um outfielder. Like he's probably on most teams not going to be a an everyday player for most teams, and especially most competitive teams in Major League Baseball. Yeah, like he has a zero WAR on this season. So he's very much sort of like a replacement level player. And but to teams that are non-competitive, a player like this is very attractive because they have multiple years of control. Maybe, he figures something out offensively. Like there is possibility that, he could uh up his value to other teams that he could eventually be used as a trade chip. But if not, he's going to play like a sufficient enough outfield for a non-contending team and just sort of like hold it down and be a placeholder. So Tyler had mentioned the possibility of like Pache getting flipped again, maybe in a package for another bullpen piece or something along these lines. So maybe that's what the Orioles have in store. But I do think that someone with Pache's skill set, like could be useful like when we get to the playoffs. But just because of how sort of deep the Orioles outfield possibilities are, it's sort of just a question if he can be utilized effectively given all the sort of roadblocks in his way to being out there. And I mean someone who like isn't really giving a lot of offensive production, it just sort of becomes a question about, well, like he's very good defensively, but how much playing time can you sort of afford a player like that for a team that is really trying to go deep in the playoffs here. So that was the first trade that happened midday yesterday. Yeah, I'm a fan of it. I'm, think it's a good move overall. And then the second trade came just a few hours after the first one. And this one was the Orioles acquired Zach Eflin from the Tampa Bay Rays um, for three prospects. Funny enough, all the age of 22. But it was basically the three players being Jackson Baumeister, Mac Horvath, and Matthew Etzel. So all of these players, that was sort of the tier of sort of how they are. Baumeister is a pitcher, starting pitcher. He sort of throws 92 to 95. He has a curveball, and he has a couple different sliders that he uses as well. So he was sort of, I think, the centerpiece from the Rays perspective about what was coming back to the Rays. So this is a guy, he definitely could make the major leagues one day. I mean, he has some command issues to figure out. I think he's generally projected as sort of a back end of the rotation guy. If he does make the major leagues, he's not likely to be someone who ends up winning a Cy Young. So I think the sort of cost that the Orioles were willing to give up was somewhat limited. Um, yeah, and Mac Horvath, he sort of I mean, he has, pull power, he hits home runs, and he's sort of, his position is a little bit of a question mark. It's a little unclear. He is spent time in the outfield. In college, he went and played outfield. But he also has experience at different infield positions. So it's a little unclear what his full-time position will be if he ever does make the majors, or even if he continues to play in the minors, where exactly he's going to be utilized is a little bit of a question mark. But or if he just turns into a guy that plays multiple positions, like that is a possibility for him too. But so he was the second piece that went, and then an outfielder, sort of the lowest I guess tiered prospect that the Orioles gave up, Matthew Etzel. So Horvath and Baumeister are both in, according to Fangraphs, in the Orioles top 45 prospects. So it wasn't insignificant what the Orioles gave up. I think Baumeister, I'm not remembering exactly, but I think was like the 13th rated Orioles prospect. So there is sort of a thing. So yeah, so this was sort of the return that the Orioles gave up to get Zach Eflin from the Rays. Now, as far as Eflin goes, definitely a very solid starting pitcher. He's been around the majors for a long time. He will probably be our number three starter, right behind both Burns and then Grayson Rodriguez. And so he'll slide into the number three spot. And, he's good. I mean, he's a ground ball pitcher. Uh, he doesn't get a ton of strikeouts, but he also has a very low walk rate. He's been throughout his career, he's never been a guy that has walked people. So he has very good command. And yeah, he attacks the strike zone. So, and he gets a lot of ground balls. So, he's around, like, he has around a 4 ERA this year. He's probably a guy that in general will be in the high threes, low four ERAs. And he is, you know, Eflin is not, I would say he's not exactly, I would say he's part of the solution to the Orioles starting rotation issues. He is not, so sort of how I was thinking about this with the Orioles. I was trying to sort of figure out the Orioles' approach sort of going into this deadline, and I think their acquisition of Eflin is reflective sort of how they are thinking about this deadline. So, of course, the Orioles, there were rumors about getting Tariq Skubal. That doesn't seem like it's going to happen. That would also require some of our best prospects in order to get Scooble, because Scooble is great with multiple years of control. So in order for the Orioles to land him, I mean, the conversation was the Orioles would have to give up Jackson Holiday, right, in order to get him, which makes sense to some extent. I'm not saying it makes sense for the Orioles to do, but it makes sense that that would be the price. But it could also be someone like Basayo or someone like Mayo that the Orioles would have to give up in order to get Scooble. So the Orioles didn't end up going in that direction, which I think says a lot actually about how Mike Elias and the Orioles are thinking about this year. So I think that the Orioles, now I do want to caveat that it's very, very, I would say likely that the Orioles are not even done. Uh, so the and that that more moves are coming for the Orioles. So yeah, just thinking about this trade, going and getting Zach Eflin, going and getting a number three pitcher. I will note also, this was an interdivision trade that happened, right? So, the thing about this, I think that it does sort of show where the Orioles are thinking about their team and the project. I do feel like some of the recent struggles have given the Orioles pause about the ability for this team to compete and to make a serious, serious and competitive run at the World Series this year. And I think Eflin and Dominguez are both manifestations of the sort of thought process that Mike Elias is operating with at the current time. Now, neither of these guys, this is not like a Juan Soto type acquisition. This is not the Orioles going out and getting Scooble or the Orioles going out and getting a rental for this year and sort of putting all the chips in to try to win the World Series this year because this team is perfect. And if we just get this one added player to put us over the top, then we will win the World Series and we feel good about it. I think that's not where the Orioles mindset is. I think the Orioles know that we have a very good team and are getting players that will one sort of stabilize the team in so stabilize in the sense that like sort of in the long term, right? So I think like it's not like the Orioles acquired these players to get us out of this current slump that the Orioles, the current struggle that the Orioles are playing. Like it's not like that, right? But in the long term, to sort of stabilize certain areas of this team, right? So Zach Eflin being a three starter, giving the Orioles more depth, like especially making the rotation longer, especially with a lot of the uncertainty around it. Now, this Eflin move, it is worth noting, I think, probably would not have happened if we did not lose Kyle Bradish earlier in the year. Tyler pointed this out. I mean, I don't think it's a an incredible observation. I think it is pretty intuitive. But if Kyle Bradish was in this rotation and was pitching like normal Kyle Bradish, probably we would not have gone and gotten Eflin in the same way. Or if we had, he would probably be the only starting pitcher that we would go get. Whereas now it's still debatable if the Orioles are going to go get even one more starting pitcher. So, yeah, so that is sort of worth noting as far as like the context of this move. But this is, yeah, this getting Zach Eflin is getting a three starter, not another ace to try to put this team over the top to try to win the World Series. I think both of these things are moves that will hopefully stabilize areas on this team and that if things go right when we get to playoffs, will these are moves that will allow us to at least be in the mix to potentially compete for a World Series if other conditions on this team are right, and if other things on this team are going well. So I think that when you think about what the Orioles gave up in both of these exchanges, like, yes, like they're not nothing. Austin Hayes is so Austin Hayes is like a current major league player that sort of like was not playing full time. So the Orioles sort of utilized him to get something that the Orioles were sort of maybe desperate is a little too extreme, but not by much. Like desperate to get back end help, back end bullpen help. So, yeah, the fact that the Orioles were comfortable trading this level of prospects, right? And that the Orioles have not touched Basayo, have not touched Mayo or Holiday. I think it does speak to where the Orioles feel like they're at this year with trying to win the World Series. I think the Orioles need to, but it is very important that, like, I do think the Orioles needed to sort of patch some areas of this team up um, for moving forward. So, this I think will be helpful in the sense that, for one, we will have Eflin next year. Now, Eflin will be owed $18 million next year, which is not insignificant, but I think that that is more or less a fair, quote unquote price for what his value is at the major league level. So, yeah, but I think that the Orioles were comfortable giving up the prospects that they were because they weren't all in. They're not comfortable putting all their chips in for this year. And they're making acquisitions like Dominguez and like Eflin that will extend beyond this year. They're going to help us this year too. But both of those players, we at least have the ability to. We will have Eflin next year, barring we trade him somewhere else, which I don't think is likely. And as far as Dominguez, we can have next year if we want him. So both of these trades are recognition and acknowledgement that, like, okay, there are enough concerns on this roster that, we're not willing to trade to go all in, to trade Holiday, to get Scooble. We're not willing to do that. But um, you know, in the right context, in the right environment, this team could win a World Series. And we are trying to bolster the roster this year and also allow our window uh, to, not allow our window to be open because hopefully it'll be open for the next few years. And these acquisitions aren't extending our window, but they're going to both be useful options for us to have next year as well. So, and they're going to make the team better next year. So they're both acquisitions that, we haven't gotten a rental, right? We haven't gotten a player that is a contract that has a contract expiring at the end of this year, right? And I think that is significant and it means something. And I think it indicates how Elias and the Orioles organization is sort of approaching this year and also thinking also about the long term. So I think from that perspective, I think the Orioles are sort of doing the right thing here. I think it would be a mistake to trade some of the real serious and significant prospects too early, especially if we were trading them for guys where maybe this is not on the table, but the Orioles are not going to trade Jackson Holiday for a rental whose contract expires at the end of the year. But I do think that, right, like with someone like Scooble, there's risk in acquiring even a very good pitcher, in a way that risk does not exist for a position player. So even though there would be multiple years of control for Scooble, parting with someone like Jackson Holiday, I think the Orioles have sort of calculated, I think rightfully so, that like that doesn't make sense. Now, Mayo, Basayo, those are a little different questions in terms of how willing are you to part with either of them? But I think they are. I mean, neither of them are like, well, maybe that's not fair to say. I was gonna say they're not like that far off Holiday, but Holiday, they're like the second and third prospects, best prospects in the organization, basically. But as far as, I mean, Holiday is the first, but he's sort of, outer world type prospect. So but in any case, yeah, so that's sort of like where sort of where I think the Orioles are approaching this trade deadline with an appropriate mindset. I think they're not willing to make serious compromises for the future with someone like Baumeister. Like, yes, he might be a major leaguer. Any one of those three could be a major leaguer. But I do think that sort of they're assessing like, okay, well, even if he is a major leaguer, the ceiling, we're not giving away a Cy Young candidate here, right? So the ceiling is probably, a back end of the rotation starter, and we're comfortable with that to get a number three starting pitcher for our team for a year and a half, despite the cost that we are going to be adopting. So, of course, a lot of this, I'm sure, for the Rays, a lot of the inspiration for this trade is the salary dump because they like, especially they're not very competitive right now. So this was an opportunity for them to offload salary to the Orioles, which we will gladly adopt. So I think they are good moves for the O's overall. They're not moves that are outer world. They're not blockbusters, but they are solid additions to this the team this year. And hopefully, even if they themselves are not going to help us win a World Series, they will be, if the rest of the team around them starts playing well, they can be useful additions and be contributors to a World Series. We're not expecting Zach Eflin to turn into Bumgardner and put the Giants or put the team on his entire back and pitch them to a World Series. But if other things are clicking for the O's at that time, someone like Eflin can be helpful and really useful. So the one thing about Eflin, despite being on the Rays and the Phillies, in terms of starting, he hasn't had so Eflin has like been in the bullpen historically in the past. In addition to being a starter, he's sort of fluctuated between the two roles. So as far as Eflin goes, he did have one start in the playoffs last year for the Rays. Didn't go very well. He didn't pitch well. So it's not like he's bringing playoff experience with him, sort of in the same. He's bringing playoff experience with him, but playoff success with him. Um, yeah. So that's one sort of thing to think about, but that doesn't mean he can't pitch well in the playoffs. Like it's just more of a question mark, and we'll see. But the Orioles are not acquiring him for like explicitly the playoffs this year. We just see this is a good starting pitcher. We need starting pitching, and let's get him, and hopefully he can do well for us when we get to the playoffs. So, um yeah, so we still have a few more days before the trade deadline. So there is a lot that can happen. In the meantime, we will be back hopefully more promptly to discuss anything that happens with the trade deadline. But so far, two solid moves. I'm not I don't think Oriole fans should be terribly upset or scared about what the Orioles compromised. Maybe, some of us out there might like some of these players in particular. I know Austin Hayes, maybe people have an emotional attachment to. But I don't think the Orioles compromised anything significant regarding like winning and losing or regarding the long-term outlook of this organization or the long-term health and outlook of this organization. The Orioles still have one of the best farm systems in baseball, and we did not touch any of the really key prospects so far. So, yeah, I will mention one more thing Tyler said that trading with the Rays is always scary. Uh, that is true. That is true. And it always feels like when you trade with the Rays, maybe there is something they know that you do not. They have a better read on things, but hopefully that will not be the situation. But overall, yeah, I'm happy about both of these moves. The Orioles are now a better team than we were just a couple days ago. And so things are moving in a positive direction off the field for the Orioles. But hopefully soon enough that will translate to on the field as well. So we will be back on here sometime soon. Yeah, we'll be back on here sometime soon to talk about further stuff that happens. So yeah, a lot of trade deadline stuff. Of course, there is other news. Maybe we will compare sort of how the Orioles did at this deadline relative to other teams. The just before I got on here, there was big news. The Yankees got Jazz Chisholm, so that's sort of a big deal. So I think yeah, we'll sort of have after at the end of all of this, we'll sort of summarize everything, I think, and talk about what yeah, how the Orioles can carve out a World Series attempt for themselves. So we will see. But in any case, yeah, thank you all for listening. Feel free to follow the show. Please give us a 5-star rating, write a review. We have a YouTube channel. Subscribe to us on YouTube, the Warehouse Podcast. If you just search that, we will pop up. Feel free to comment on our YouTube videos with any thoughts, analysis, disagreements that you might have. If you would prefer, you can feel free to contact and reach out to the show at thewarehousepod@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter mainly, but you can also follow us on Instagram at the Warehouse Pod. And yeah, hope everybody is feeling good about this trade deadline. Not too scared, not panicked, not sad. Anybody who's sad about Austin Hayes going, I am sorry. Yeah, I know that there are plenty of fans that like him, as well, that like him, just because he's been around so long. Maybe people have personal experience knowing him. So, yeah, this is a really, I know for a lot of teams, a lot of fans, trade deadline is a very difficult time period because, there's a lot of, and it, especially if Cedric Mullins gets traded, it's going to be a very difficult emotional time period for me. But overall, I'm with all the fans who uh, may be struggling right now, and yeah, are getting, you know, feeling the sad effects of, the business side of baseball. So if you are one of those fans, I am mentally there with you, and uh, yeah, I hope that hope it's not too emotionally difficult. So in any case, thank you all so much for listening. Yeah, this has been the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse. We'll see what happens at this deadline, and go O's.